Waiter refuses to serve. Elderly, black woman stunned when her son reveals who she is. The golden glow of a late September afternoon poured through the towering windows of the Magnolia Room, an upscale restaurant tucked in the heart of Savannah, Georgia, a city where history whispers through moss-draped oaks and modern life hums with Southern charm. But tonight, something feels different. A quiet tension simmering in the air, a secret waiting to unravel, a story about to unfold, making diners pause mid-whisper as silverware clinks against fine china. Can you sense it? That stillness before the storm? Let us pull you into this tale, but first, tell us, where are you watching from and what time is it there? Subscribe now so you don't miss the moment everything shifts. Inside, the space buzzed with life. Soft guitar notes drifted from a corner near a sleek bar lined with bourbon bottles. This wasn't just any restaurant. It was where Savannah's elite gathered. Businessmen in tailored blazers swapped real estate tales. Couples leaned close over candlelit tables, and tourists marveled at polished hardwood floors and exposed brick walls that radiated heritage and luxury. The Magnolia Room was a haven of celebration, a slice of Southern hospitality wrapped in sophistication. Then, the heavy oak door creaked open, and a subtle hush rippled through the room, not loud, not overt, but enough to turn heads. Who just walked in? Why does the room feel different now? An elderly woman stepped forward, her presence both striking and understated. At 78, Clara Jackson moved with quiet resolve, her steps measured yet firm, her silver hair swept into a neat bun that gleamed under the chandelier's soft light. Her burgundy dress was simple yet elegant, its hem faintly embroidered with roses, perhaps a nod to the gardens she'd tended for decades. A small leather purse hung from her wrist, and her dark eyes scanned the room with a calm that felt almost regal. To a casual observer, she might seem like a grandmother out for a rare treat, but something in her posture, her very being, hinted at a story far deeper than it appeared. Diners paused, forks hovering over plates of shrimp and grits or pecan-crusted salmon, their curiosity stirred by this solitary figure who seemed both out of place and entirely at home. Clara was no stranger to scrutiny. Growing up in Savannah during the Jim Crow era, she'd learned early how to navigate spaces where she wasn't always welcome, how to hold her head high when eyes lingered too long or voices dropped to whispers. Now, decades later, she'd carved out her place in the world. A retired schoolteacher who'd shaped generations of children, a widow who'd raised 3 kids alone after her husband's death in '89, a woman who'd watched her city evolve from segregation to something closer to unity, though never quite perfect. Tonight, she'd come to the Magnolia Room not for nostalgia or to prove a point, but to treat herself to a meal. Her youngest grandson had just started at Morehouse College, and she wanted to mark the moment. To an American audience, Clara might embody the resilience of countless grandmothers, unsung heroes who've weathered storms, raised families, and held communities together without fanfare. The young hostess, Emily, stood behind a polished podium, her blonde ponytail swaying slightly as she adjusted her earpiece. "Good evening, welcome to the Magnolia Room," she said, her Georgia drawl softening her words. "Do you have a reservation?" Her eyes briefly swept over Clara, the burgundy dress, the modest purse, and for a fleeting moment, a flicker of hesitation crossed her face, subtle but there, raising a question. Does Clara truly belong here? To an American audience, this moment might feel familiar, a quiet judgment that slips into everyday encounters, a trace of biases we think we've outgrown but haven't fully shed. "Yes, Clara Jackson," Clara replied, her voice warm and steady, like when she used to read to restless classrooms. Emily nodded, her fingers gliding over the tablet screen. "Found it, Miss Jackson. Please follow me." She led Clara through the dining room, weaving past tables where laughter spilled over glasses of sweet tea and wine, the guitarist's slow rendition of Georgia on My Mind, mingling with the aroma of buttery cornbread and roasted pecans. Clara followed at her own pace, her gaze drifting over the faces around her. Some met her eyes with a nod, others quickly looked away. For an American audience in 2025, the scene might stir a mix of pride in Clara's quiet dignity, unease at the faint undercurrent of tension, and a recognition that even now, places like the Magnolia Room carry echoes of a past not fully reconciled. Emily stopped at a small table near the back, just a few steps from the swinging kitchen doors, a spot where the clatter of pots and the occasional shout of "order up" drifted through the air. It wasn't the prime real estate of the dining room, where the best views overlooked the cobblestone street outside or the cozy fireplace crackled with warmth. Clara didn't flinch. She eased into the chair, smoothing her dress with a practiced motion, and set her purse beside her. "Here you go, Miss Jackson," Emily said, handing her the menu. "Your server will be with you shortly. Enjoy your evening." Her smile lingered a moment longer. Then she turned back to the podium, her heels clicking against the floor. Clara opened the menu, her fingers tracing the edges of the leather cover, and began to read. Oysters, Rockefeller, braised short ribs, a peach cobbler that sounded like a taste of home. She'd already decided to splurge a little tonight. It wasn't every day you got to celebrate a grandchild carrying your legacy forward. Around her, the room buzzed on. A man in a pinstripe suit 2 tables over laughed loudly, recounting a golf game gone wrong, while a young couple near the window snapped a selfie with their cocktails, the glow of their phones lighting up their faces. But Clara's arrival hadn't gone entirely unnoticed. A middle-aged woman in a floral blouse leaned toward her husband, her voice dropping to a whisper. "She's by herself. Wonder what her story is." Her husband shrugged, slicing into his steak, but his eyes flicked toward Clara for a moment. Across the room, a waiter, a lanky guy in his early 30s named Marcus, glanced her way, then quickly turned back to pouring water for a group of 4. The attention wasn't hostile, not yet, but it carried a weight, a curiosity tinged with something harder to name. To an American audience, this might feel like a snapshot of everyday life. Those small, fleeting moments where differences in age, race, or circumstance spark quiet questions, even in a place meant to bring people together. Clara settled in, her expression serene. She'd come here for herself, for her grandson, for the simple joy of a good meal in a city she'd helped shape. But as the minutes ticked by, the hum of the restaurant seemed to shift ever so slightly, setting the stage for something more. For readers in the U.S., this could be a hook that resonates. A woman who embodies the strength of a nation's past stepping into its present, her quiet presence a challenge to the room, and maybe to us, to see beyond the surface. The minutes stretched on at the Magnolia Room, and Clara Jackson sat patiently at her small table near the kitchen, the menu still open in front of her. The guitarist's rendition of Sweet Home Alabama floated through the air, blending with the clinking of glasses and the occasional burst of laughter from nearby tables. But something was off. Marcus, the lanky waiter in his early 30s with a faded tattoo peeking out from under his rolled-up sleeve, had breezed past her table 3 times now, once with a pitcher of water, once with a tray of appetizers, and once with nothing at all, his eyes fixed straight ahead as if she weren't there. When he finally stopped, it was brief, almost reluctant. "Hey, sorry for the wait," he said, his voice clipped, his smile more of a tight line than a welcome. "It's a busy night. Give me a sec, and I'll swing back." Clara nodded, her tone as warm as ever. "No rush, thank you." But as Marcus hurried off, she couldn't help but notice the difference. At the table to her left, a group of 20-somethings in jeans and blazers, probably fresh from one of Savannah's tech startups, had their water glasses refilled the moment they sat down, their orders taken with a grin and a quick, "Y'all are gonna love this." A couple near the window, barely older than her grandson at Morehouse, giggled over a shared plate of fried green tomatoes, Marcus lingering to chat about the best spots for live music downtown. Yet here she was, 78 years old, dressed in her Sunday-best burgundy, waiting longer than seemed reasonable. It wasn't loud or blatant. No one was shouting slurs or pointing fingers, but it was there. That quiet sting of being overlooked. the kind that gnaws at you because it's so hard to call out. To an American audience, this might hit close to home. The subtle slights that pile up in everyday life, especially for those who've lived long enough to know they shouldn't have to prove their worth. Clara adjusted her purse on the table, her fingers brushing the worn leather. She wasn't new to this. She'd sat at the back of buses as a girl, stood in separate lines at the grocery store, taught kids in underfunded classrooms while others got new books and shiny desks. She'd earned her stripes in a country that often asked her to wait. Wait for justice, wait for respect, wait for a seat at the table. Tonight, she'd come to celebrate, not to fight, but the delay was starting to feel personal. A woman, 2 tables over, her hair streaked with highlights and her neck draped in a chunky necklace, leaned toward her friend and whispered something, her eyes darting toward Clara. The friend nodded, stealing a glance before sipping her wine. Across the room, an older man in a golf shirt frowned slightly, as if trying to figure out why she was alone, why she didn't quite fit the vibe of the Magnolia Room. The attention wasn't hostile, but it was heavy, and it made the air around her table feel thicker, the celebration she'd planned starting to sour. Marcus returned after what felt like an eternity, his posture stiff. "All right, sorry about that," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "We're slammed tonight. Might be a bit before I can get to you." His tone carried an edge, like he was doing her a favor just by stopping. Clara's lips curved into a faint smile, the kind she'd perfected over decades of keeping her cool. "That's fine," she said, her voice steady. "I'll be here." He nodded and darted off again, leaving her with an empty water glass and a growing sense that this wasn't just about a busy night. For Americans reading this, it might stir a mix of frustration and recognition. How often do we see someone dismissed not for what they've done, but for who they seem to be? Clara wasn't about to make a scene. She'd never been one for theatrics, but the tension was building, a quiet storm brewing beneath her calm exterior. From a table near the bar, a man in his early 40s watched it all unfold. James Carter, the owner of the Magnolia Room, sat with a glass of unsweetened tea, his broad shoulders relaxed but his hazel eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. Dressed in a charcoal button-down, he blended in with the crowd, unassuming, just another guy enjoying the evening. Except he wasn't. This was his place, his pride, a dream he'd built from the ground up after years of hustling in Savannah's restaurant scene. And the woman at table 12? That was his Aunt Clara, his mother's older sister, the woman who'd helped raise him when his parents were working double shifts at the textile mill. She'd been the one to drill multiplication tables into his head, to slip him an extra $5 for comic books, to tell him he could be more than the small apartment they'd shared in the 90s. Tonight, she'd told him she was coming by to celebrate her grandson's college start, and James had been looking forward to surprising her with a complimentary dessert, peach cobbler, her favorite. But now, as he watched Marcus dodge her table like it was a chore, James felt a knot tighten in his chest. He'd seen the way Marcus lit up for the younger crowd, the way he lingered with the loud suits and the flirty couples, while Clara sat there, patient as ever, her dignity unshaken, but her presence ignored. It wasn't just bad service, it was personal. James knew Clara's story, the years she'd spent teaching in Savannah's public schools, the way she'd faced down prejudice with a quiet strength he'd always admired. He'd built the Magnolia Room to be different, a place where everyone belonged, where the South's best flavors came with a side of respect. Yet, here was his own staff, treating his aunt like an afterthought. To an American audience, this might echo the frustration of seeing a loved one undervalued, a reminder of how even the spaces we create can fall short of our ideals. James tapped his fingers on the table, his jaw tightening as Marcus laughed with a group of guys in polo shirts, cracking a joke about the Braves' latest game. A young woman at a nearby table whispered to her date, "Why's that lady still waiting?" Her date shrugged, but his eyes flicked toward Clara, then away. The unease was spreading, a ripple through the room that Marcus seemed oblivious to, or maybe he didn't care. Clara reached for her water glass, found it empty, and set it back down with a small sigh. She wasn't angry, not yet, but James could see the faint weariness in her shoulders, the kind that comes from carrying too much for too long. He'd seen it before, back when she'd come home from parent-teacher nights with stories of kids who needed her more than their own folks could manage. He leaned back in his chair, weighing his next move. He could step in now, call Marcus out in front of everyone, make it a lesson for the whole staff. But James wasn't rash. He'd learned patience from Clara, learned that sometimes you let people show their true colors before you act. So he stayed put, his gaze shifting between his aunt and the waiter, waiting to see how far this would go. For readers in the U.S., this moment might feel like a crossroads, a test of character, a chance to confront the small injustices that hide in plain sight, and a question of what it means to stand up for family, or for what's right. The air in the Magnolia Room grew taut, the once lively hum of conversation dimming as the tension around Clara Jackson's table thickened. The guitarist had shifted to a slower tune, Tennessee Whiskey, a crowd favorite, but even its smooth chords couldn't mask the unease creeping through the restaurant. Marcus, the waiter in his early 30s with a faded tattoo snaking up his arm, returned to Clara's table after another long delay, balancing a tray of steaming crab cakes destined for a group of boisterous guys in khakis near the bar. He paused just long enough to toss a half-hearted question her way. "Still figuring out what you want?" His tone teetered on the edge of dismissive, like he'd already written her off as someone who didn't belong in Savannah's trendiest dining spot. Clara looked up from her menu, her dark eyes steady and kind, but carrying a quiet weight that made Marcus shift uncomfortably. "I'm ready to order whenever you've got a minute," she said, her voice as calm as a summer morning, betraying none of the frustration she might have felt after nearly 20 minutes of waiting. Marcus sighed, a sharp, audible huff that cut through the ambient noise, and glanced around, as if hoping someone else would swoop in and save him from the exchange. "Yeah, all right, I'll be back," he muttered, barely audible before turning on his heel and disappearing toward the kitchen, the tray wobbling slightly in his grip. Clara watched him go, her hands resting lightly on the table, her burgundy dress catching the soft glow of the chandelier above. She wasn't rattled, not outwardly, but the room was starting to feel it. A woman in a sundress at a nearby table nudged her husband, whispering, "She's been sitting there forever. What's his deal?" Her husband shrugged, but his brow furrowed as he stole a glance at Clara. Across the dining room, a guy in a falcon's cap tilted his head, muttering to his buddy, "Service here's usually on point. What's up with that table?" The murmurs were growing, the kind of low buzz that signals a storm brewing, and yet Marcus seemed either oblivious or indifferent, his focus locked on the louder, flashier tables that tipped big and laughed at his small talk. Clara reached for her water glass again, found it still empty, and set it back down with a faint clink. She'd come to the Magnolia Room to celebrate her grandson's start at Morehouse, a milestone that felt like a victory for her whole family, a testament to the years she'd spent teaching, saving, and praying for better days. But now, that joy was being chipped away, not by anything loud or dramatic, but by the slow drip of neglect. To an American audience, this might sting. A reminder of how often the elderly, especially women like Clara who've given so much, get pushed to the margins in places meant to honor everyone. She wasn't about to raise her voice or demand attention. That wasn't her way. She'd faced worse than a distracted waiter, decades of red tape, sidelong glances, and closed doors, and she'd always met it with grace. But tonight, that grace was being tested, and the situation felt like it was spiraling toward a point of no return. How long could she sit there, invisible in a room full of people, before something had to give? From his spot near the bar, James Carter watched it all, his fingers tightening around his glass of unsweetened tea. At 42, he'd built the Magnolia Room into a Savannah staple, a place where shrimp and grits met craft cocktails, where locals and tourists alike felt the warmth of Southern hospitality. But right now, it wasn't living up to that promise, not for his Aunt Clara. He'd seen Marcus dodge her table again and again, watched the way he lit up for the younger crowd, while his shoulders stiffened every time he passed her by. James had poured his heart into this place, named it after the trees his aunt used to point out on their walks when he was a kid, telling him stories of resilience and roots. Seeing her treated like this, by his own staff, in his own restaurant, felt like a betrayal of everything he'd worked for. The tension was unbearable, a knot in his chest that tightened with every passing second. He wanted to act, but he held back, letting the moment stretch, knowing that whatever came next would change the night, and maybe more. James couldn't take it anymore. He set his glass down with a quiet thud and stood, his movements deliberate, his broad frame cutting through the dining room like a ship through still water. The guitarist faltered mid-chord, sensing the shift, and a few heads turned as James crossed the floor. He reached Marcus just as the waiter was leaning over a table of 4, cracking a joke about the humidity while handing out plates of fried okra. Marcus straightened up, his grin fading when he saw James standing there, arms crossed, hazel eyes locked on him. "Hey, boss," Marcus said, his voice catching slightly. "Didn't see you there. Everything good?" He tried to flash that easy smile, the one that usually smoothed over late orders or spilled drinks, but it didn't land this time. "I've been here the whole time," James said, his voice low but firm, carrying the weight of someone who didn't need to shout to be heard. "And I've seen everything." Marcus blinked, his brow creasing. "Seen what?" he asked, a nervous edge creeping in. James tilted his head toward Clara's table where she sat upright, her gaze now fixed on the two of them. "Seen you ignore my Aunt Clara," he said, each word sharp and deliberate, "who's been sitting there for almost half an hour without so much as a glass of water." The color drained from Marcus's face, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from the river. He turned to look at Clara, really look at her this time, and saw her watching him, calm, composed, but with an intensity that made his stomach drop. Your aunt?" he stammered, his voice cracking on the last word. "Yeah," James said, stepping closer, his tone cutting through the silence that had fallen over the room. "My aunt. The woman you've been treating like she's invisible, like she doesn't deserve the same respect you're throwing at every other table in here." The restaurant went still. The guitarist's hands hovered over the strings. The clatter of dishes from the kitchen faded, and every eye in the place zeroed in on the scene. Marcus's tray trembled slightly in his hands, the crab cakes suddenly forgotten. I didn't know," he started, but James held up a hand, cutting him off. "You didn't need to know who she was to treat her like a person," he said, his voice steady but laced with a fury he rarely let show. "That's the job. That's what this place is supposed to be." To an American audience, this might feel like a gut punch, a moment of truth that strips away excuses and lays bare the cost of apathy. James turned to the bar, catching the eye of his manager, a wiry woman named Lisa who'd been hovering near the edge of the chaos. "Lisa, take over table 12, he said, his voice carrying across the room. "Get my aunt whatever she needs, now." Lisa nodded, scurrying toward Clara with a water pitcher and a menu, her apologies tumbling out in a rush. James looked back at Marcus, his expression unreadable but hard. "We'll talk later," he said. "For now, you're off the floor." The revelation hung in the air. A seismic shift that turned the night upside down, leaving Marcus, and everyone watching, to reckon with what had just been exposed. The silence in the Magnolia Room lingered for a heartbeat after Marcus's exit, the heavy oak door thudding shut behind him. James Carter crouched beside his Aunt Clara's table, his stern demeanor softening as he met her gaze. "You all right, Aunt Clara?" he asked, his voice low, tinged with the warmth of a nephew who'd grown up under her wing. At 78, Clara Jackson smiled, a small, steady curve of her lips, and patted his hand. "I'm fine, James. You handled that just right," she said, her tone carrying the quiet strength that had guided him through childhood summers in Savannah. He exhaled, the tension easing from his shoulders. "Should have stepped in sooner," he muttered, but she shook her head. "No, you let him show who he was. That's worth more than a quick fix." The restaurant hummed back to life, but the air felt different, thoughtful, heavier with meaning. Lisa, the manager, bustled over with a plate of braised short ribs and a glass of sweet tea, her apologies spilling out like a nervous kid caught skipping class. "Ms. Jackson, I'm so sorry. We'll make this right," she said, setting the food down with care. Clara nodded graciously, her dignity unshaken, and turned to her meal, savoring the first bite as the room settled. Nearby, a couple in their 30s leaned close. "Can't believe he acted like that," the woman whispered, shaking her head. "Makes you wonder how often it happens." Her partner nodded. "It's about what you do when you see it." James returned to his table, his hazel eyes still flickering with lingering frustration, but Clara's words stayed with him. For an American audience, this might hit home, a story of family, respect, and the quiet power of standing up. As Clara finished her meal, she glanced around, her gaze landing on Lisa, who offered a sheepish smile. There was no bitterness in Clara's expression, just satisfaction that the night had left a mark. James walked her to the door later, holding it open as she stepped into the cool Georgia evening. "You did good, nephew," she said, her voice a balm. He smiled faintly. "I just want this place to be what you taught me it should be." She squeezed his arm. "It is now. For readers, it's a call to action. Next time you see someone overlooked, will you speak up or stay silent? Choose respect. It's the American way. What do you think? Would you have stepped in or watched from the sidelines? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your take. And if this story moved you, hit that subscribe button. There's more coming your way, and we don't want you to miss it.